gloss over it. And now he explains what he means by God commands this. For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Now, what the law of Moses was talking about, the way they used to tread out and separate the chaff from the wheat, is they would take an ox and they would tie the ox up to a circular deal with a beam. And it rotated on a pivot in the center. And they would take the wheat and they would put it down on the floor. And they would lead the ox around in a circle, walking on the wheat, so that it would agitate the chaff and the wheat, and it would release the wheat. But the ox had to eat in order to do that. So the law of Moses said, hey, you don't tell people that they are supposed to work to feed you and then tell them they can't have any of it. Well, you know, it's kind of like the old story. There was a preacher who was really slight in his physical frame. Matter of fact, the guy looked a little anemic. He was real skinny. You can tell this story is not about me. But he had this magnificent horse. And this horse was really muscular and filled out. And he rode the horse into a meeting with the leadership of the church. And one of them, in kind of a smart-aleck way, said, hey, how come you're so skinny and puny and your horse looks so good? What are you doing with a horse like that? And he said, the answer to that's real simple. I feed the horse. You feed me. For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sake, no doubt this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things among you, it is a great thing. Is it a great thing if we reap your material things? In other words, if God has spoken to your heart, if you've been enlightened by the teaching of the leadership of your church, then what's the big deal of that person being supported by you? Now, inevitably, we get into the issue of tithing with this. There is an erroneous view concerning tithing that I'd like to dispel at this point. The tithe was the idea that of whatever you have, the first fruits of your increase, you give 10%. And they say, yep, but that came from the law of Moses. And we are no longer under the law. Let me point something out. Tithing did not originally come from the law of Moses. Tithing, the giving 10%, came and was observed by Abraham prior to Moses. Abraham wasn't a twinkle in Amram's eye, his dad. Abraham, as he met Melchizedek, who was a Christophany, a pre-incarnate incarnation of Jesus, the king of Salem, the king of peace. Abraham, after rescuing Lot and chasing down the kings that threatened Lot, he gave a tithe of 10% of all they had taken in spoil. To who? To the king of peace. The tithe was established before the law. Now you say, wait a minute, we're New Testament Christians. And as New Testament Christians, what we're supposed to do is we're just supposed to kind of give as the Spirit moves on us. That's not wrong. But it's above and beyond the tithe. That's when we're supposed to give, when the Spirit moves on us. The Scripture tells us that some people, the reason they're broke all the time is because they withheld from God in the tithe into poverty. That's why. You say, well, why are you hitting this so hard? Is it because the church has got financial troubles? We're in good shape. The issue isn't what does the church need. The question is, where are we all at with God? You see, because if you're a Christian, you're a bondservant. A bondservant is someone who doesn't own anything. It all belongs to the master. And unlike the attitude that says everything's mine except 10%, if you're a bondservant, and that's a free will deal. You choose if you're a bondservant. Everything you own belongs to God, and he says, hey, keep 90%. And everything you do for other people and in other circumstances and everything else is what's known in Scripture as a free will offering. That's your saying, God, I've given my part, but I'm a bondservant, and I love you, and I'm going above and beyond. I saw a need, I'm going to meet it. I'm going to do something with it. There's only a few places in the New Testament that even addresses this. I've been 5 years getting to this, and we have never had a lack in this church, ever. Where God guides, he provides. And he has provided. But we're here at this point in Scripture. This is where that needed to be said. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap material things? In other words, the congregation needs to be concerned about how they're taking care of the pastor and the pastor's family. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Now, you have to know something about the Old Testament. When they were ministering under the sacrificial system, when you brought meat, when you brought an animal to be sacrificed, particularly for the fellowship offering, but in the offerings, the parts that were commanded by Moses were burnt as a burnt offering and a sweet savor to the Lord. Another part of it went to the priests for their living. And he is saying here, folks, don't you realize that part of what comes in the door from the tithe and from the offering is supposed to be committed to those in ministry? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. Now listen, guys, there are two words here that are really significant. The Lord, that means the one that everybody in the church should have committed their life to, has made a commandment. So remember what Jesus said? If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. This is a commandment of the Lord. Those that preach the gospel should get their living from the gospel, what comes in. Now, all that's true, but this is the point that Paul's making. It's not about preachers' paychecks. This is what he says. But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me. For it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. You know what Paul said? I've never asked you for a paycheck. I've never asked you for anything. Now, in case anybody's curious here, I get a housing allowance, which is an amount that just helps us pay for our housing expenses. And that's it. And the reason is because it's beneficial to the church. And my wife and I have always been tithers. And I'm not saying this to tell you what a great guy I am. I'm telling you that I wised up early in my Christian walk. And I realized that I was broke all the time. And the reason I was broke all the time was because I withheld from God. And I was young and I was dumb. And I went to a church where they beat us to death with, you better tithe. And I'll tell you what, frankly, it irritated me. And fortunately, my wife was smarter than I was. And she was also further along in the Lord than I was. And she convinced me that I ought to be putting the tenth that Abraham did before the law was there. And you know what happened to us? Our financial situation improved. My work situation improved. I went from making almost nothing in minimum wage to 6 figures. And you know how it happened? Absolutely by the grace of God. I finally made a decision to finish a degree. And God made a way for me to finish a bachelor's degree. And then I was at a Christian college, George Fox. And then I was pastoring. And we needed a second income because there wasn't a lot of money coming into the church, even though the church was growing. And the only job I could get was as a social worker in a nursing home. And I never even thought of doing something like that. I went in and took the job. The administrator was an idiot. This guy used to intimidate nurses by having a briefcase on his desk. And he would open the briefcase and it had a .45 automatic pistol hooked to the inside of the cover. And I went around trying to bring peace. I was doing pastoral work to the other workers. And the other workers got together, the nurses got a hold of the administration, the people who owned the nursing home, a big corporation, and said, this guy's got a gun. And they came in and they immediately fired him. And at any rate, they got to talking to the other workers and they told them that I had been trying to diffuse the situation. And they also told him that in the first day I was there that he introduced me as an administrator in training. They had not authorized any of that. And because, as it happens, they had just been sued by a guy who had been lied to about by a ruthless administrator and told that he was an administrator in training, they immediately brought up their interview team, interviewed me, and I got to be the administrator. And I went to a salary that was 8 times higher than I had been working. And the one thing that happened when I saw what a mess this place was in, I was just going to quit and find something else to do. And God spoke to me. I mean, that deep inside voice, and he says, whatever you do, don't quit. And because I got that license for 30 years, I've been able to minister and not ask anybody for a dime. The point Paul's making here is that he's no hireling. And because he knew they were immature and they were carnal, he was not going to allow the issue of money raise a barrier that would prevent them from hearing what he was trying to teach. Now, I can tell you, the people here in this church, you're not like the Corinthians. You're decent people, and I have come to love you. The point that's being made here, for me, don't you dare use anything like that to keep you from ministering with all your heart, and to spend the time in prayer for the people, and to spend the time in preparation of messages so that they get something that will actually communicate the heart and the mind of God. Because in the day where a buck becomes the issue for you, you're done. Paul's going to say that. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. For necessity is laid on me. In other words, I preach this gospel whether there's a buck or not, whether or not there's a church or not, a church building. If it's got to be on a street corner, so be it. He says, for necessity is laid on me. I have to preach this gospel. Wherever I am, whatever it takes, whatever the sacrifice, I have to do that. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. Now, why is he laying this heavy trip on them? To make himself look good? No, he's making a point. I've got rights, and sometimes I lay them down so that I don't hinder somebody else and the gospel. And if it costs me a buck, so that somebody else might grow up and mature because they'll listen to me one more time, I'll give up my rights. Could you imagine if every Christian in a church felt the same way? Yeah, I got rights. Yeah, I deserve to be treated a certain way. But you know what? I'm going to come alongside. As I was studying this, God gave me an analogy. There's some things that every preacher of the gospel and every Christian needs to know. If you're going to stand up with this kind of commitment for God, you better get ready because you're headed for a fight. The enemy is going to come after you with a vengeance. It's not going to get easier. It's going to get harder. So when you show up with this kind of commitment, saying, I'm going God's way, no matter what it costs, when I hear something in His Word that says, this is the way you should live your life, and this is what you should do, and it rubs me because I don't